Snow fell softly outside the general store, clinging to the windowpanes like lace. Inside, the air smelled of pine needles, ground coffee, and damp wool coats hung too close together. A small pot-bellied stove crackled in the corner, throwing orange light across the wooden floor. That was where the widow sat, her wide body folded carefully onto a narrow bench, as if she were afraid to take up more space than allowed. On her lap rested a cardboard box, frayed at the edges, filled with handmade ragdolls. Their yarn hair was uneven, their button eyes slightly mismatched, but each wore a tiny stitched smile. The little girl stood near the counter with her father, her boots still dusted with snow. She couldn't stop staring. There was something about the way the woman held the box, like it was precious and fragile at the same time. The girl tugged at her father's sleeve, once, then again, until he looked down. "Daddy," she whispered, careful not to be rude, "why is she sitting all by herself?" Her father followed her gaze. He was a tall man, shoulders squared from years of ranch work, his coat worn thin at the elbows. He hesitated before answering. "That's Mrs. Calder," he said quietly. "She makes dolls to sell around Christmas." The girl frowned. "Why isn't anyone buying them?" The father didn't answer right away. He watched as a pair of women glanced at the box, exchanged a look, and then turned away toward the candy display. Mrs. Calder pretended not to notice, but her fingers tightened slightly around the cardboard edge. "People can be unkind," he finally said. "Sometimes without meaning to be." The girl slipped her hand into his, her small fingers warm despite the cold. She studied the widow more closely now. Mrs. Calder's coat was too thin for December, stretched tight across her back. Her cheeks were red, not from warmth, but from the effort of sitting upright for hours. Every so often, she adjusted the dolls, straightening a ribbon here, smoothing a sleeve there, as if hoping that care alone might make them more desirable. The bell above the door jingled as another customer left, laughter trailing out into the snow. Mrs. Calder's eyes followed the sound, then dropped back to her lap. The girl felt something twist in her chest, a feeling she didn't yet have words for. She pulled her hand free and walked closer, slow and cautious. Mrs. Calder looked up, startled, then softened when she saw the child. "They're beautiful," the girl said, pointing at the dolls. The widow smiled, a real smile that lifted her tired face. "Thank you, sweetheart. I made each one by hand." The girl picked up a doll with a red stitched dress and yarn braids. "She looks like she needs a home," she said seriously. Mrs. Calder laughed gently. "I suppose she does." The girl turned back to her father, holding the doll against her chest. Her voice was small but certain when she asked, "Daddy, can we bring her home for Christmas?" The store seemed to grow quieter after the girl spoke, as if even the stove paused to listen. Her father cleared his throat and stepped closer, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He knelt beside her, resting one hand on her shoulder, and studied the doll she was holding. The ragdoll's seams were a little crooked, the red dress faded from too many washes, but there was a tenderness in it that couldn't be stitched by machine. "Honey," he said gently, "we came in for flour and sugar, remember?" The girl nodded but didn't loosen her grip. "I know. But she shouldn't be alone for Christmas." Mrs. Calder shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "It's all right," she said quickly, her voice soft and practiced. "I'm just glad someone likes them." She began to lift the box from her lap, as if preparing to pack it away. The father straightened and met the widow's eyes. For a moment, he saw past her size, past the frayed coat and tired posture, and noticed the careful stitches on the dolls, the pride trying to survive behind her politeness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, then hesitated. "How much for the doll?" he asked. Mrs. Calder blinked. $2, she replied. "But if that's too much." He placed more than that into her hand without comment. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the money. "Oh," she whispered, surprised. "Sir, that's more than." "For the time," he said simply. The girl smiled up at him, relief shining in her eyes. She hugged the doll tighter, then looked back at the widow. "Do you have family?" she asked, innocent and unguarded. Mrs. Calder's smile faltered. "Not anymore," she said after a pause. "It's just me now." The girl considered this carefully. "We have room," she announced, turning to her father. Grandma's old room is empty. And Mama says Christmas is for sharing. A few heads turned. The father felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden weight of his daughter's faith in him. He glanced at Mrs. Calder, who was staring down at her hands, as if afraid to hope. "That's a kind thought," he said slowly. "But we can't invite people home without thinking it through." Mrs. Calder stood, setting the box on the bench. "She's right to be kind," she said, forcing a lightness into her tone. "But I wouldn't want to be a burden." The word lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. The girl stepped forward again and reached for Mrs. Calder's hand, wrapping her small fingers around the widow's rough palm. "You wouldn't be," she said firmly. "You make dolls. And you look cold." The father exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He saw the truth in his daughter's eyes, a truth simpler than all his careful reasoning. He looked at Mrs. Calder and nodded once. "Why don't you come for supper?" he said. "Just for tonight. We can decide the rest later." Mrs. Calder's eyes filled, and for the first time in a long while, hope felt less like a risk and more like a door left open. The ride home was quiet, the truck tires crunching over frozen gravel as dusk settled over the fields. Mrs. Calder sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, the box of remaining ragdolls balanced carefully at her feet. She kept glancing out the window, as if memorizing the snow-dusted fences and bare trees, afraid that if she looked away, the moment might disappear. In the back seat, the girl whispered to her new doll, introducing it to the passing world. When they reached the farmhouse, warm light spilled from the windows, glowing gold against the blue evening. The girl leapt from the truck and ran ahead, throwing the door open with a burst of cold air. "Mama," she called, "we brought someone home." Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and roasting meat. The girl's mother turned from the stove, surprise flashing across her face before she noticed the widow standing uncertainly in the doorway. The father spoke quickly, gently, explaining in few words. There was a pause, just long enough for Mrs. Calder to feel the familiar urge to apologize, to retreat. Instead, the mother smiled and wiped her hands on her apron. "You must be freezing," she said warmly. "Come in. Supper's almost ready." The widow's shoulders sagged with relief as she stepped inside. She had forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed without questions. The girl took her coat, hanging it carefully, then tugged her toward the table as if this had always been the plan. During supper, Mrs. Calder ate slowly, savoring every bite, embarrassed by her hunger but grateful beyond words. Conversation flowed easily. The girl talked about school and Christmas songs, the father asked about the dolls, and the mother listened, her eyes kind. Mrs. Calder spoke of sewing late into the night, of her husband's steady hands that once cut the fabric for her, and of how the house had grown too quiet after he passed. After the dishes were cleared, the girl insisted on showing Mrs. Calder the empty room. The bed was neatly made, the quilt folded back in invitation. "You can stay as long as you want," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Later, as snow tapped softly against the windows, the widow sat by the fire, mending a loose seam on one of the dolls. The mother joined her, handing her a cup of tea. Their knees nearly touched, a closeness that felt unfamiliar but comforting. In the corner, the father watched his daughter asleep on the rug, the ragdoll tucked under her chin. He understood then that Christmas wasn't only about opening doors to others, but about letting something new enter and change the shape of home. Mrs. Calder looked around the room, at the laughter, the warmth, the quiet acceptance, and for the first time in many winters, she felt she wasn't just visiting. She felt, gently and unmistakably, that she belonged.